I have to be honest and say that I did not watch the video. I cannot watch the video. Um, I have too many things in my head already from witnessing and seeing violence in the correctional settings. The culture of corrections is a violent culture. And so that's just the reality of how incarcerated men and women live under the fear of being raped, beaten, or murdered while incarcerated. And so um, I just, my mind just cannot take watching that video.
It almost sounds like you didn't have to, right? You kind of had an
No,
idea what happened, right?
right. To be quite honest, I've seen numerous women get beaten brutally, and for the grace of God, they weren't killed. And so th- that's just commonplace in corrections.
What was your experience like in seeing some of that? What did it happen to you? Did you see others? I mean, what was that?
Was I was threatened,
Hmm.
but I was never harmed. So I consider myself fortunate in that sense. I was afraid once when I was in solitary confinement. I was only in solitary confinement for about 24 hours. I was taken out immediately because I shouldn't have never been in there. An officer, put a razor in my boot and tried to set me up. But luckily, the superintendent at the time, who was Superintendent Andrews, and the lieutenant who did my hearing knew that that was something I just wouldn't have done. And so I was able to come out of SHU. But while in there, I was threatened. Like it was really frightening while being in solitary, but just for that 24-hour period.
Obviously, this unfortunate, horrible tragedy speaks to a culture. What is that culture that you saw, you experienced, and that you know it to be even all these years later?
Well, for a few years now, there's been this Close Rikers campaign, which I have not been um 100% on board with because I feel like it's not the building, it's the people in the building, the correctional staff, the security staff, the civilian staff. So the culture of corrections is like a virus and it just spreads. And it's been there. Like if you think about corrections as a whole, if you ever read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, you know that there's always been an undertone of violence dating back to the times of having people enslaved, Black people enslaved. And so it's built out of that culture. And so I've watched women get brutally beaten in Nassau County Jail. Um, there was an incident in Albany County Jail. Um, I've seen it repeatedly in the state facilities in Groveland when the Groveland was open to the women back in the 90s. In Albion, I watched so many women get beaten badly in Albion by officers, and they come like five and 5 to 10 officers for a little woman, and they have these really big boots that they wear, very big boots, and they're just stomping like it is kicking and stomping. It is brutal. And to think that you have men who are 6 feet tall beating on a woman who's like 5'2". And so again, that entire culture is just riddled with violence,
What
riddled with it.
I guess what provokes? I think we had somebody in the newsroom ask like, what happened before? Like we're like, we don't know. I guess how this like what even provoked this to escalate to this point. I guess what provokes an officer to start more? I guess to go there. Is it a premeditated thing or is it at spur of the moment? I guess from what you've seen, I guess what is the trigger to something like this violence that happens?
It's almost animalistic in nature. It's like they're waiting to pounce. The slightest thing. There's a thing where if you're in solitary confinement, where you have to tuck your arms like this against the wall. If you flinch, if you drop your fingers just a little bit, they will jump on you. It's the slightest thing. I mentioned Groveland Correctional Facility. We were in the mess hall and having breakfast. It was early in the morning. We were having breakfast, and one of the girls, I mentioned her on my podcast, but her name is Freddie Krueger. That's what I knew her as. And she was talking, and some of her saliva hit a sergeant. She didn't spit on a sergeant, and she was HIV positive. So they grabbed her and tussled her in the mess hall. It wasn't as severe as what happened a little while later. After the mess hall, I had to go to sick hall, which is you sign up and you go see the nurse because I wasn't feeling well. While I was sitting in sick hall, they brought her into medical. And when the only thing I saw at first was this huge fist come around the corner and just you could hear her jaw crack. And the next thing you know, it was like 4 or 5 more officers just beating this girl, just beating her. And the nurse, it was a female nurse, she just stood there. And I was thinking to myself, you guys got upset because some of her saliva hit the sergeant. I can't remember his name right now, but you beat her bloody. So if you was afraid of the saliva because she's HIV positive, you just kept getting more enraged because now her blood, it was just like, it was unimaginable what I saw. And this is Nassau County Jail. The girl they beat in Nassau County Jail, her name was Diane McLeod. She passed away now, but um, it was late at night and she was having an asthma attack and she just wanted a pump to get to medical. So she was making noise so they can hear her to come in. They drug her out the cell. They drug her out by what they call the officer's bubble. And when you stand up and you look out your cell door, you can see them just beating her and standing on her neck. And she was screaming, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. Then she stopped screaming. And that's when all of us started screaming, you're killing her, you're killing her. And I guess someone came and stopped it. But this is the culture. This is what they do. And the things that I've seen are just a drop in a bucket to what others have witnessed, what others have gone through. I mentioned on my podcast this morning that um a girl called me last night. Her watching that video kicked up all the feelings of when she was brutally beaten while incarcerated. So she needed someone she could just talk to in that moment because she was really going through something.
I guess living like that, I guess is that, and obviously people are in there. You're in there for a reason, one reason or
Right.
another, but still, I guess what is that life like at the end of the day? Knowing that obviously you have prison life is one thing, but this is a culture that obviously impacts your day-to-day feel like of anxiety and sure up
Right.
a lot of different factors. You just mentioned a trigger that's an anxiety thing, right? At the end of the day for some.
There's a walkway in Albion Correctional Facility, and you have to come through what's called the Sally Port, which it locks, the gates lock, and there's a little area where the officers have a booth, and you have to go through there from the dorm buildings where you live to go up to the rec or the yard or your various programs. So you walk through that Sally Port. Now I wasn't there, but I remember there was again, I don't know her real name, but her name was Fantasy, and they locked her in a Sally Port. My understanding was they handcuffed her to the gate and they just brutally beat her. I do believe there was a lawsuit behind that, but I'm not 100% sure. Um, so knowing about that, whenever I walked through that Sally Port, which was 3 or 4 times a day, there was this tenseness that happened because you know that they could lock those gates and you could get harmed. Um, I remember one night an officer it wasn't a movement, and it's very unusual for you to be called and it's not a movement time. And I got called to the library up the hill. I was so afraid to go. I didn't know what I was being called for. I was very close to going home. I might have had a month or two left, and I didn't want to go. I remember telling my officer, I said, "Why are they calling me? Why do I have to go? Like, what is it?" And he was like, "I don't know. You have to go." Officer Mack called me to the library. Once I got up there, I found out it was nothing. But the fear. I had of having to go through that Sally Port, not knowing why I was called. I was very afraid.
You know, I mentioned earlier about Canny going around different prisons and auditing them, seeing what's going on, speaking to inmates. This particular one in Marcy, you know, 2 years ago, I mean, their audit was pretty damning, I guess, for lack of a better term. It showed a lot of flaws and that the HALT Act wasn't being followed. Why do you think, you know, this isn't just contained to Marcy, I guess? Why doesn't something happen after some reports like that come out? I get that was 2 years ago. Like, what's the holdup here for change and for this culture to be shifted? Because obviously it's being exposed. There's just no action being taken.
First time, let's make these individuals a little bit more human and say incarcerated instead of inmate, incarcerated men and women. Um, this is the thing. When they go around and they call it accreditation or they come around and they check the facilities, they call ahead and the facilities know that they're coming. And so what they do is they tell the women, we were just talking about this last night, they tell us, oh, they're coming in and the best dorm, the cleanest dorm is going to get a pizza and a late night. I've never seen anyone get this pizza, but you're almost under the threat of down there cleaning the floors behind the toilets with the toothbrushes and getting up on the vents and cleaning the vents. I am begging Attorney General Tish James to start going into these facilities unannounced. Don't allow them to tuck away or hide away people that might actually really need to talk to them. Don't give them that opportunity. Show up in those admin buildings unannounced and say, I want to walk through your facility and talk to and don't walk through this facility with the depth of security. Because see, this is the problem in a lot of these facilities is nepotism. You have the depth who might be related to an officer on a unit, who might be related to the lieutenant, who might be related to the superintendent. It's all these small towns where these prisons are, especially Western New York and upstate New York. Those little towns depend on those prisons, and most of the prisons are populated by husbands and wives. There was a lot of husbands and wives in Albion Correctional Facility. Um, so if the attorney general would start making unannounced visits to these facilities, she would see more than what she would see when it's a scheduled visit for accreditation so they can see what's going on in the facilities for real, so they can really shine a light on what's happening. This is not uh an isolated incident. It is so unfortunate that um Mr. Robert Brooks was murdered like that. It's so unfortunate. He did his crime. He was serving his time, but he wasn't sent there to have a death sentence. And that's what happened to them by the hands of very corrupt correctional officers, both security and civilian. Because it is heartbreaking to know where I sit right now, there's someone in Albion Correctional Facility who is afraid. There is someone in Albion facility who might have got raped today. There's someone in Albion's facility who might have got beaten today. And just because there was a body cam that was on, the truth is out about what happened to Robert Brooks. If not for that body cam, they would have lied. They would have covered that up. And from the commissioners on down, they cover up what happens in those correctional facilities.
You just spoke at the beginning of the answer about how to describe individuals that are incarcerated. There was a press conference in August at the Great Meadow Correctional Facility, a rally protesting against that closure. State Senator Dan Steck said he described individuals as animals twice.
Mm-hmm.
How does that impact the culture that we're describing right now? That kind of nomenclature.
When you start putting that type of language out there to the public as we're animals, you expect them to treat us like wild animals, wild beasts, when you start saying that. So when you hear about someone getting brutally beaten or murdered, you already have been preconceived in your mind to think, well, this was an animal. This was a wild person. They might have deserved it. No one deserves to be beaten like that. No one deserves to be murdered. No one deserves to be raped. No one deserves to be afraid laying in their cubicle or on their bunk wondering what's going to happen tomorrow. No, when I tell you that my last state incarceration, I lost so much weight because I was so afraid of what one particular sergeant was going to do to me. I just was so afraid. Like, we went from the razor in my boot. We went from, all these incidences because he thought incorrectly that I knew who was bringing drugs into the facility. I had no idea because I wouldn't give him information that he thought. He threatened to have my urine. He's going to pull my urine and make my urine dirty. He was going to see to it that I lost my release date, all these things. So I never left the dorm. The only good thing I had in my favor during that time was I had two dorm officers who understood my fear and just was like, they just kind of just said, you know what, you can stay in. You can stay in. I went nowhere. I refused to go out the door.
How does change happen here? You just mentioned unannounced visits for the attorney general, but I guess how do you change a culture?
You don't change the culture. You rip it up root from the roots. They have to reimagine what corrections looks like. They have to start thinking because the system, I use the word broken in my podcast, but I started to think about that word. It's not broken. It is designed to do exactly what it's doing. So there needs to be a reimagining of corrections as a whole. This should not, we're supposed to be going there when you get in trouble and you go to prison and you have to serve your time for rehabilitation. How can someone really dig into rehabilitating when they're literally under this cloud of fear? So you're almost fighting for your life on a daily basis while you're incarcerated. And I kid you not, uh, you know, there's a bar in Albany. I don't know if it's still there. It's across the street from St. Peter's Hospital, and a lot of the officers, the correctional officers, have to come to Albany to do some of their training throughout the year. So I used to live over in that area in Pine Hills, and one night I was coming home and I was driving down my block, and I saw the van, and you could tell by there's some words on the van. You could tell what facility they're from, and I could tell that was an Albion van, right? And I went in the bar because I wanted to see what officers it were. And when I went in there, I sat right next to them. And I can't remember their names now, but I remember one was he worked the J block and he was so mean. And I sat right next to him. And I said to him, I said, you never know who you're going to see after everything you did to those women in Albion Correctional Facility. You never know who you're going to see on the outside. And I just got up and walked out. I didn't wait for a response. I just got up and walked out because what they do to us is crazy. That's the only um just to just to watch a small woman get beat by eight big officers with those big boots. Do you really think I needed to watch the Robert Brooks murder? I pretty much have it in my head. I pretty much know what they did. That's who they are. It's a culture of violence, whether it's violence through rape, whether it's violence through a beating, whether it's psychological violence, the threat of violence, or actual murder. That's who they are.
If you had a message or you could speak to the governor or docs today, what would you say to them?
I don't know what I would actually say to the governor, but I would say to Attorney General Tish James is please investigate those prisons. I would urge the legislators to pass the sexual assault bill that Senator Salazar has gotten past the Senate twice now. It just hasn't passed in the Assembly. and get that bill going, because that will take the ownership of docs from investigating themselves and have an outside entity investigate docs. I would encourage that the Inspector General's office get involved. That's where I don't know that my message would be exactly to the governor, but my message would be to the Attorney General's office and Inspector General's office. They must investigate these facilities. And we're not just talking state facilities. I'm talking city, county, and state. The culture of corrections runs through all of them.
Roni, as always, appreciate your time. Thanks.